To introduce our author and later discuss the book with him, I begged KPFA's general manager, Quincy McCoy, longtime pal of Dave Talbot. After David's talk and their discussion, David will sign copies of his remarkable corrective to the historic record here on stage. Please give a warm welcome to Quincy McCoy.
Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to an evening of worldwide intrigue, mystery, mayhem, and murder. No, we will not be discussing the latest espionage novel by John le Carré tonight, but it may sound like his clandestine world occasionally. We will travel to the dark staging ground, the center of America's greatest untold spy story, where lurks an evil man who maintained his powerful control of the innermost secrets of our government for decades by employing some of the most ruthless, deceitful, cruel tactics imaginable. He transformed the Central Intelligence Agency into the most powerful and secretive colossus in Washington today. This man is Allen Dulles. The Devil's Chessboard, David Talbot's explosive and disturbing portrait of Allen Dulles, the longest-serving director of the CIA, proves that he was one of the wiliest masters of secret power ever produced by America. In Dulles' near decade as CIA director, he manipulated and subverted American presidents like pawns in his pursuit of his personal interest and those of the wealthy elite he counted as his friends and clients. He colluded with the upper echelons of the Nazi Party, German war criminals, Eugene McCarthy, Dick Nixon, and the Mafia in his long chain of nefarious operations. He targeted foreign leaders for assassination and aided in the overthrowing of nationalist governments that were not in line with his political and economic gains. Dulles' motto was to protect American business interests worldwide at all costs. David Talbot takes us into the depths of these menacing historical characters, drawing on new revelatory materials, including freshly discovered U.S. government documents, U.S. and European intelligence sources, the personal correspondence and journals of Allen Dulles' wife and mistress, and last but not least, Talbot exposes shocking new evidence that points directly at Allen Dulles' involvement in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Our distinguished guest tonight is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Brothers, The Hidden History of the Kennedy Years, and the acclaimed national bestseller about the soul of San Francisco, Season of the Witch. He is the founder and former editor-in-chief of Salon, and was editor-in-chief of Mother Jones and feature editor of the San Francisco Examiner. Please give a warm welcome to my friend, Mr. David Talbot.
Well, hello, Berkeley. Thank you all for coming out tonight to hear conspiracy theories. I want to also acknowledge Peter Dale Scott. Peter, thank you for coming. And for those who have had a chance to see, take a look at my book, you know that I pay great tribute to Peter as one of my mentors and inspirations. But don't blame poor Peter for everything I'm about to say tonight. And Dr. Gary Aguilar next to him, also someone I've had many great stimulating conversations with throughout this history. And forgive me if I am not spotting others that I should be mentioning. Well, look, I'm just going to begin with a few, hopefully somewhat provocative remarks, and then Quincy and I are going to have a conversation, and I hope to have some interesting dialogue with you then as well, because I know many of you have been immersed in this area yourselves, and I'm sure it'll be a very interesting discussion. But let's start with conspiracies, because that's the way, in some quarters at least, my book is being knocked down by our own San Francisco Chronicle, among others. Of course, conspiracies, one person's conspiracy theory is another person's investigation into deep power, or the deep state, as Peter Dale Scott has described it. And some of these investigations are simply too disturbing in a psychic way, in a political way for our society to handle. And so this conspiracy theory, tag is a way of shutting off debate, is often a way of shutting off further introspection. But there are conspiracies and there are conspiracies. There are actually official conspiracies as well. Gulf of Tonkin, of course, was a conspiracy by the Johnson administration to get us into the Vietnam War. Watergate was actually a welter of many different conspiracies. We could spend all night unraveling that. Iran-Contra. Hillary Clinton's vast right-wing conspiracy that I covered when I was at Salon turned out to be rather true, that there was a very well-oiled Republican machine that was fueling Ken Starr's investigation and had targeted a sitting president over a consensual sex act and a bogus real estate scandal back in Arkansas. That was also a conspiracy of power. The 2000 election in Florida, possibly the 2004 election, WMDs and the Iraq War. What Ed Snowden brought to our attention, the vast surveillance operation that's been invading all of our privacy. So these obviously are all official conspiracies, and there's nothing theoretical about them. They're widely acknowledged now in most quarters to be true. The government, in fact, is still promoting many conspiracy theories about the Russians and Putin and the so-called New Cold War, about the Islamic State and whether or not it's worth being permanently at war in the Middle East. Even recently, the CIA has revived one of its favorite conspiracy theories because the CIA is a master at actually spreading conspiracy theories or disinformation. And this, of course, is the recent redacted and carefully choreographed release of documents that Phil Shannon, a former New York Times reporter, ran with in Politico. Politico, by the way, bumped me after planning to run something from my book so they could run this piece by Phil Shannon instead. And in this, he basically alleges once again, and this is the oldest, I think, perhaps JFK conspiracy theory there is, it was being promoted by the CIA before JFK's body was even cold, which is Fidel Castro killed Kennedy. It's not true. The CIA knew it was not true, but it began spreading that lie, as I say, over 50 years ago and revived it right before my book came out. Interesting timing there. So JFK assassination, of course, is the third rail. It's just a deeply taboo subject. For someone like me who spent my whole life in the media, it was a surprise to me because I came to this late, certainly later than Peter Dale Scott, but it was a surprise to me at how deep that taboo runs throughout the media. And so I knew when I wrote The Devil's Chessboard, there were going to be many things that were provocative about this book. It was my attempt to draw together everything that I've learned as an activist and as a journalist and a historian in my lifetime, and to do nothing less than to present the epic story of the battle between the forces of democracy in the last 60 or more years in America and the forces of secrecy and permanent war. And I knew that it was going to provoke a sharp reaction, and I'm glad of that. And the JFK section of the book, which is the final third of the book, of course, has provoked the sharpest reaction. But the truth is that Allen Dulles was a symbol of a force in America that we still have yet to deal with. And that's the force of secrecy, of official violence, and covert violence. And I think as a people, we have allowed the violent machinery, the covert machinery that Allen Dulles and his colleagues built so long ago, to continue decade after decade in perhaps the naive belief that what that machine was doing overseas would not someday come back to haunt us. It was as if, to use an analogy that Hillary Clinton used not long ago, you thought that you could have a beast in your own backyard or your neighbor's backyard and not expect it to come through your door at some point. But I believe that is what happened, that the machinery of violence, of subversion that Allen Dulles and his colleagues built during the Cold War went into overdrive, of course, after 9/11. And we're still paying for those sins. You know, C. Wright Mills, I try to people my book with some heroes as well. It is a bit Game of Thrones-like, my book. I hope it's gripping. I think most people have found it gripping. Even the criticisms of it, there was one critique of it in a CIA-friendly website that said, damn, this is a good read, but none of it's true. It should have been a novel. So it is entertaining, even for the CIA. But, I did want to bring out this sensibility, this consciousness that I think has been ruling the country for so long. And one of the people who I think, even before Peter Dale Scott, was one of our great analysts, our great critics of power in America, of course, was the great sociologist C. Wright Mills. And he's a great hero of mine, a great hero in this book. He broke from the Cold War intellectual hegemony at the time, when most of the intellectual class was being subsidized by the CIA through various organizations and foundation grants and conferences and so on. C. Wright Mills refused to take that path, and in a very clear-headed and very brilliant way analyzed how the power elite functioned in this country. And of course, the power elite is not just one man. It's not Allen Dulles. It's not just Allen Dulles' brother. The Dulles brothers were part of a network of power, a system of power. And C. Wright Mills, I think, nailed it. And this quote, I think, is particularly relevant from C. Wright Mills' book, The Power Elite, even today. I mean, think of this now, in the context today. But he was writing this during the height of the Cold War, back in the 1950s. Quote, "For the first time in American history, men in authority are talking about an emergency without foreseeable end. Such men as these are crackpot realists. In the name of realism, they have constructed a paranoid reality all their own." That's the paranoid reality that we're still living in. That's the true conspiracy. They have created a conspiratorial world themselves, and it's our job as citizens and as historians and as journalists to unravel that reality. I point out the fact that democracy is a rather fragile enterprise in the prologue of the book. Athenian democracy, the very cradle of democracy, lasted barely 2 centuries. And throughout that entire period, it was besieged from within by forces of oligarchy, of military despotism, by conspiracies, by assassinations. It's only our democracy's only hope is when all of us are vigilant enough to fight and protect it. It seems to me a rather weak and feeble institution these days as we enter yet another carnival of electoral carnival, presidential season. But at the end of the day, I've seen it. Peter Dale Scott once spoke about this very optimistically. We have seen these amazing uprisings that surprise us all. Occupy seemed to be a flash in the pan, but we've seen civil rights movements, we've seen anti-war movements, we've seen populist movements, we've seen people hit their tipping point and their breaking point when they say enough, no more. This is our country, it's our democracy, and we're going to stand up and fight for it. So I hope my book doesn't discourage people. It is a dark epic, but it's a hell of a read. I think you'll learn a lot from it, and I think we're going to learn a lot tonight together in this conversation. And at the end of the day, I still think the people have the power, as Patti Smith sang and wrote. Thank you very much.
All righty then. So about...
Let us pray, right?
So about 3 years ago, we were in Los Angeles, you and I. We were having dinner with Oliver Stone. And you leaned over and you said to Oliver, Oliver, I figured it out. I know who killed Kennedy. And he said, who? And you said, Allen Dulles. And he went silent. And he was sitting there, he's looking around, he was doing that Oliver thing. And then, bam, he hit the table. Damn it, David, you're right. How come I didn't think of that? It's really interesting.
Although Allen Dulles does make a brief appearance in JFK, actually, in documentary footage. So Oliver was onto that pretty early.
Yeah, well, my question is about that because I was there, and so I wanted to know, because that was before you went out and did all the research and all the travel and started going through all these documents and everything. What was the initial clue that pointed you to Allen Dulles?
Well, again, this is Peter Dale Scott night. I have to blame or credit Peter for this. So after my book Brothers came out, Brothers, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, was my attempt to trace Bobby Kennedy's journey, his emotional journey and his political journey, his investigative journey after his brother was killed. I had read references here and there to the fact that Bobby had never accepted the Warren Report, the official version. And I found that just incredibly intriguing. I had grown up with the Kennedy drama. I'd worked on Bobby Kennedy's campaign for president in California as a kid, as a teenager in 1968. And so Bobby Kennedy always was a very inspirational figure to me. And when I heard that he, former Attorney General, a famed investigator with the Senate Rackets Committee, someone who knew more than probably anyone in public life at that point about the dark corners of power, that he had his own suspicions, I wanted to find out what exactly he was thinking. So I pursued that, and I got as far in that book as Bobby Kennedy basically got. Bobby looked immediately at the CIA's operation against Castro as the source of the plot against his own brother. He thought something had happened there that violent target, that violent focus of that operation had shifted to his brother at some point. But I didn't know specifically who the primary players in that were. And I was wrestling with this for a while after Brothers came out. And Dulles became more and more intriguing to me because I was thinking, who has the gravitas within that power elite? Who has the connections, the necessary connections in the business world, in the intelligence world, in the military world, to have green-lighted, as they say in Hollywood, something this epic, a crime this epic? And Dulles just seemed to me to be the leading suspect. Again, I don't want to, and Peter always admonishes me not to put too much on this one man's shoulders. But I also I'm a believer in the strongman theory of history to an extent. I've seen this in my own life, in business, running salon and dealing with people in the business world. I've seen it in politics. Individuals are important. Individual leaders are important. If you don't have a charismatic or a strong leader who has wide respect in a particular circle, things often don't get done. And particularly, I think this is true in worlds like Washington. So anyway, one day, Peter and I had just had lunch with my colleague, Karen Croft, who I couldn't have done the book without. Karen and Peter and I are friends. And Peter mentioned the fact that he, as a young Berkeley scholar, and he can correct me if I'm wrong here, had been invited to a dinner by people who were involved with the Hoover Institute down at Stanford, very conservative group. And just like you'd expect today with conservatives get together, bitching about Obama, the dinner party conversation quickly turned to Kennedy and what an outrage he was, how he was weak on Cuba, and how he was, taking the country to hell in a handbasket. And suddenly, sort of one of the alpha males in the group, a Russian emigre, a priest, got up and sort of calmed the dinner table by saying, "The old man will take care of it." And Peter at the time thought that was a reference to old Joe Kennedy, the patriarch in the family, who was known for sort of, stepping in and giving his sons advice and being their, guru and their big daddy. But I knew by that point, the date of this dinner, that that old man, had had a stroke, a massive stroke, and was incapacitated and was not able to give JFK or Bobby any advice, really. But I did know from the research I'd already begun that Alan Dulles was known within CIA circles very affectionately as the old man. So the old man will take care of it. And that just resonated with me. And I know I've made maybe a little bit more of this than Peter, as the very diligent scholar he is, would want me to. But it's sometimes like a song, a lyric, or a piece of poetry will connect with you, and you'll begin to sort of make other connections. That's what that one conversation with Peter did for me that day. The old man will take care of it.
Well, speaking of a strongman policy that you brought up, in the Devil's Chessboard, you usher in an amazing cast of shadowy characters that kind of perfectly describe the atmosphere of the Cold War era. So let me just throw out a few names and let you shine your investigative light on them. Well, let's start with, first of all, let's start with Dulles' law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. Tell us about that.
Powerful. Probably the most powerful law firm of its day. John Foster Dulles becomes the chief counsel there at a very young age. These, both the Dulles brothers were groomed for power very early on. Born into a family not particularly wealthy, but very well connected. And through his connections, he becomes the top lawyer at this very powerful firm. This is the 1930s when he's really sort of coming into his own, Foster. And the great, of course, challenge for Wall Street at that point is how you resist Franklin Roosevelt's reforms, his efforts to regulate the kind of rampant capitalism that's put the country at such risk and sunk the country into depression. And so Foster, at one point, gathers all his corporate clients, or some of his key ones, in his office and says, resist, don't obey. The SEC, Glass-Steagall, just resist. And so that's the sort of mentality of the Dulles brothers. Sullivan and Cromwell was their initial platform of power. Alan Dulles becomes essentially an espionage agent for Sullivan and Cromwell, making payoffs overseas when his clients' assets and investments are threatened or jeopardized in other countries. So he becomes a corporate, intelligence agent before he actually becomes, a top spy in Washington. This is Alan. But that was their initial power platform.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that Harry Truman then. He started the CIA, correct? Or was his...
He did, 1947, yeah. But of course, he never intended it to become what it became, and Harry Truman later thought it had become a Frankenstein. And jumping a little ahead, after the Kennedy assassination, he writes this very provocative op-ed piece, Truman, in the Washington Post. And the whole country at this point is still very, emotionally fraught, still trying to absorb this national tragedy. And here a former president comes along in this context and writes this startling op-ed piece saying the CIA basically is out of control. And not just overseas, threatening democracies overseas and our reputation as a country, but also our own democracy at home. Well, this is a bombshell, as I say, in that context. And Alan Dulles doesn't want to let it stand. And so he proceeds to use intermediaries to try to get Harry Truman to change his mind, to retract what he just wrote. And Harry Truman, of course, is a famously stubborn guy, and he refuses. And so Dulles actually flies down then to Independence, Missouri, where Truman is retired, and meets with him at the Truman Library, and again puts pressure on him, saying, you must not have spoken correctly. Mr. President, of course, you started the CIA. This is what you intended it to be. Truman will have none of it. He refuses to retract it. So what does Dulles do? He does the next best thing. He can't change reality. He can't change Truman's mind, so he changes the record in true intelligence fashion. He writes a letter for the record to the general counsel of the CIA saying, I met with Harry Truman, and he didn't really know what he had done, and he wasn't aware of really the ramifications of what he was saying, and presents him as a rather senile character who has been manipulated by an aide, perhaps, And so that becomes sort of the official CIA record of this incident with Harry Truman. And it percolated throughout various CIA accounts of this for years after.
What about Dwight Eisenhower? When he was elected in 1952, wasn't that, well, you say in your book that the power elite took over in the country?
Well, I think Dwight Eisenhower is the classic example of what I just said. A person who thought you could create this beast, because Eisenhower was very culpable, I think, very responsible for allowing this national security beast to grow to great proportions. And of course, he warned us as he was leaving, thanks Ike, about the military-industrial complex, but he was responsible for overseeing the growth of that military-industrial complex and the secrecy state. He empowered the CIA. He wanted to avoid a shooting war, another world war at all costs, and so he basically went about creating war on the cheap through the CIA. The CIA was his main iron fist around the world, and I think basically Eisenhower signed off on most, if not all, of the major dark deeds that Allen Dulles and the CIA were responsible for during those years.
Howard Hunt.
Yeah, Howard Hunt. Howard Hunt was, of course, a legendary CIA officer. Came to attention of most Americans after Watergate as the leader of the burglary team that broke in at the Watergate. But he's one of these fascinating characters. Talk about deep state characters who pops up in so many different guises and so many different crises in American political life. And just following his trajectory, is fascinating. So Hunt, is one of Allen Dulles' gung-ho shadow knights. He's particularly keen on, going after Castro. He's deeply involved in the anti-Castro operation. He is involved in Guatemala and tormenting Jacobo Arbenz, the popular leader of Guatemala, even after Arbenz is overthrown and his family is driven into exile, and I tell that story. And he pops up again and again in these interesting ways. He pops up at the end of his life making some kind of veiled confession that he himself was involved in the Kennedy assassination. And his son, St. John Hunt, is convinced that his father was in Dallas then and did play a role. So, interesting guy, and loved Dulles, was devoted to Dulles, was mortified when Kennedy fired Dulles, and continued to stay close to Dulles afterwards when Dulles was supposedly retired. That's another story I tell in the book, that even after Dulles was supposedly retired and in exile, he basically, in exile, sent up an anti-Kennedy government out of his home in Georgetown, meeting with his deputies and continuing to advance anti-Kennedy policies.
Last but not least, this one character in the book, William Harvey.
Well, William Harvey is
dark character.
Now we're getting it to the center of things. Mm-hmm. William Harvey was a very colorful guy who distinguished himself during the Cold War in Berlin. Was the guy who came up with the idea of building this tunnel into East Berlin to spy on the Soviets. Allen Dulles loved that kind of daring do. He was promoted by Dulles. He brings him back to the United States, gives him the highest medal that the CIA can bestow on an agent, and then he's promoted basically to lead the operation to kill and overthrow Castro. And he proceeds to pick up where Robert Mayhew, a private contractor who worked for the CIA before then and had begun to recruit the mafia to do this, he picks up where Mayhew left off, dealing with mafia characters like Johnny Roselli. And he falls afoul of the Kennedy brothers during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when at the height of this terrible crisis, when the whole world is on the nuclear brink, Harvey and other agents in the CIA decide to send raiding parties into Cuba. An incredibly reckless and provocative act. And when Bobby Kennedy hears about this, Attorney General, and someone who'd been given the Cuba portfolio by his brother, he flies into a rage. And to save his career, basically, his protectors at the CIA, people like James Angleton and Richard Helms, send Harvey to Rome. to become station chief there. And this becomes a very interesting then chapter in this whole drama, because William Harvey in Rome, and this comes from his deputy, Mark Wyatt. Mark Wyatt is dead, but I tracked down his grown children and also another source, an investigative journalist in Europe. And this story is not fully told, but I think I flesh it out in an important way. Basically, Harvey goes about doing what Harvey does in Rome. Among other things, he's suggesting that the mafia be recruited to kill communist officials, democratically elected communist officials in Italy. He's suggesting that false flag terrorism, acts of terrorism be undertaken, blowing up Christian democratic offices and newspapers in order to smear the left and blame it on the left. So he's doing what Bill Harvey does. Obviously, there's no smoking guns. We can talk about why there are no smoking guns. But I make a case that William Harvey was involved in the assassination. I think that beast that was created to kill foreign leaders, Patrice Lumumba, Fidel Castro, and others, and by the way, people at a lower level than that, because the CIA later said we were a gang and couldn't really shoot straight. Yeah, we tried to kill people, they told the church committee and other hearings, but we really weren't very effective about it. But they were being far too modest. The CIA built a very lethal killing machine that was very effective. And there were lots of killings of opposition political figures, of journalists, of union activists, in many hot zones during the Cold War, Guatemala and others. And if the CIA agents themselves didn't do it, there were contractors and criminal elements who they utilized to do those killings. I believe that very lethal killing machine, with people like William Harvey involved in it, was brought home to kill the President of the United States. So that's what I meant earlier, that you can't have a beast operating in your neighbor's yard and not expect it to come into your own yard.
We're going to cover some of those people you were just talking about, like Patrice Lumumba, in a second. But what I found despicable about Alan Dulles was his connections to the upper echelons of the Nazi Party. Can you talk about his dealings in his relationship with the Nazis?
Yeah, well, this again is the amorality of the Dulles brothers and the amorality of power in general, because there was much more, I think, collaboration between the U.S. intelligence forces and the Nazi regime during the war even, and after the war certainly. But the Dulles brothers really began to forge these relationships with Nazi business interests and political figures before the war at Sullivan and Cromwell. Many of their clients are notorious, later become very notorious. I.G. Farben, the chemical conglomerate that manufactured, among other things, Zyklon B, the gas that was used to exterminate Jews. They were exchanging Christmas cards right up to the war and actually into the early days of the war. I believe that Alan Dulles wanted to be sent to Switzerland instead of London, where most of the OSS was, because Switzerland was this kind of Casablanca-like atmosphere, this closed off from the rest of the world because the Nazis had surrounded it. He had very little oversight from Washington there. It was impossible, really, to have much authority over Dulles while he was in Switzerland. And instead of focusing his efforts on defeating the Third Reich, he was more intent on meeting with emissaries from the Third Reich, including from Heinrich Himmler himself, and cutting a separate deal with the Nazis, a peace deal, which he finally did do in the final days, literally the final days of the war, through a covert, secret operation called Operation Sunrise. He brought about an early surrender just by a matter of days with Nazi forces in Italy. Well, this was in direct contradiction of the Allied policy that was worked out at the Casablanca Conference in 1943 of unconditional surrender. Franklin Roosevelt said very firmly there, because Joseph Stalin, who was after all taking the brunt of Hitler's onslaught, over 20 million dead in Russia, and he was deathly afraid that the Allies were going to sell him out by cutting a separate deal with Hitler. And so Roosevelt, knowing how important the Soviet Union was as an ally, made a very firm statement there: no separate deals, we're going to crush Hitler's regime and bring these people to justice. But Dulles didn't get the memo, or he did get the memo, but he ignored it. And so he spends most of the war, as I say, trying to cut a deal and actually looking out for the assets of his former clients or current clients. Many of course, the Swiss banks were colluding with the Nazi regime. Nazi money was being laundered there, and Dulles was a big part of all of that. So just leave it with one of the more, after the war, in the final days of the war, of course, as many of these war criminals are escaping via these so-called rat lines from Germany over the Alps down through Italy. Dulles is involved in opening the prison gates, literally, for many of these people, just as they're being grabbed by diligent U.S. intelligence officials. And he even rehabilitates one in particular, Reinhard Gehlen, who becomes the top spy master after serving as spy master for Hitler, becomes the top spy master in post-war democratic Germany, and serves in that post, very powerful post, throughout much of the Cold War.
We're going to have to start taking some questions from the audience, or we're going to need the CIA to get us out of here. So, but I have one more question I wanted to ask you. There was something very interesting, the Operation Splinter factor and the case of Noel Field. I mean, it was very disturbing to me, that story in your book. Can you just talk about that for a minute?
Well, my colleague Karen Croft, who studied psychology at Stanford, is convinced that Alan Dulles is a psychopath. And of course, there have been studies of people in power that suggest to be in power, you have to be on the spectrum in some way. And he certainly was, I think, at one end of that spectrum. How he related to his own children, his own family, the things he did as a CIA spy master. But certainly, one of the examples of that would be how he dealt with this man, Noel Field, and his family. So Noel Field had grown up in a Quaker family. His father was a scientist, and they had grown up in Switzerland. And Dulles had met the family when Noel Field was a young boy. And he was a very earnest, idealistic young boy. He'd seen the horrors of World War I, and he became a pacifist. He believed in world peace. He was a dewy-eyed idealist in many ways. And he later goes to work in the State Department and then realizes that he has dual loyalties because, like many young idealistic people, some of whom were in government service during the New Deal in the 1930s, he also is sympathetic to the Soviet experiment. And he starts having dealings with the Soviet Union. So in order to avoid, this being compromised, he decides to go overseas, and he goes to work as an international relief worker, which he does throughout the war in a very committed and brave way. After the war, he's committed to, world peace still, and goes about doing various humanitarian projects. But he falls into Alan Dulles' clutches at some point. And Alan Dulles comes up with a brilliant idea with his colleague Frank Wisner. They called it Splinter Factor because it was a way of splintering the Soviet Empire and further exacerbating Joseph Stalin's paranoia. So I won't go into all the details, but basically Noel Field is fed by Dulles and the CIA into the clutches of Stalin, and they communicate the idea that Noel Field is a master spy at work for Dulles. And this begins kind of triggers the series of events that lead to mass trials, show trials, people being rounded up in many countries behind the Iron Curtain, being tortured and executed and so on, including Noel Field himself, is horribly tortured and imprisoned for years behind the Iron Curtain, and his wife as well. And then his brother comes looking for him, and he's grabbed and also badly treated. And then the stepdaughter of Noel Field, also a young woman named Erica Baldock, again crosses into East Berlin, leaving her children and husband behind because she feels she has to do something to save this family that had taken her in during the war and had rescued her own family. So, Allen Dulles had this saying that he once said to his mistress, she asked him, how can you be so charming to your people that you are enemies with or that you have suspicions about? He said, well, I like to see the little mice's expression as they fall into my trap, and I see their little necks broken. And,
sounds like a sociopath to me.
And I think Noel Field was one of those little mice that Dulles tended to use again and again in his career. I think another mouse like that was Lee Harvey Oswald.
So here's a question from one of the audience members. Do you think that Allen Dulles derailed the Paris peace talks between Eisenhower and Khrushchev in 1960 by sending Gary Powers' flight over the Soviet Union?
Well, that's a provocative question, and I actually don't have a firm position on that. There are people like Fletcher Prouty, who's, of course, who was at the time in a position to know about that. He was a Air Force colonel who was the liaison, actually, between Allen Dulles and the CIA and the Air Force. And he thought that the U-2 spy plane was in some way sabotaged, and the U-2 was supposedly invulnerable to Soviet missiles. It flew at such a high altitude that it was impossible to knock down. Eisenhower was assured of that by the CIA. If you read Eisenhower's papers, you see a running theme throughout his second presidency after the U-2 is developed, is he's very concerned about the U-2 being shot down and creating an international incident. And he keeps putting moratorium on U-2 flights from time to time. He keeps asking in national security meetings about how vulnerable the plane is and so on. And he, against his better judgment, agrees to go along with this one last flight before the planned conference in Geneva, where I do believe Eisenhower wanted his legacy as a leader of peace to be finally established. But of course, the Powers is shot down, and it does become a big international incident, and the summit is canceled. So what do I think? I don't know what to think. I think Prouty might have a point, but I don't have enough evidence.
What about the question here is about could you elaborate more about Patrice Lumumba's case?
Yeah, well, Lumumba was of course, this very charismatic leader in Africa, the Congo. The Congo had just thrown off the yoke of Belgian rule, probably one of the most evil and oppressive colonial regimes in history. And he's the hope not only of the Congo, but in some ways of all these young African nations that are starting to emerge from colonialism. JFK has, as a senator, sort of given these winds of change, these nationalistic movements, his blessing. Many African leaders actually coming to JFK's Senate office to meet with him. And so Lumumba, though, has a very brief run as president, because even though he was not a communist, he was portrayed that way by the CIA. What he was a nationalist who was interested in getting sovereign control over the Congo's mineral resources. And that threatened, just like Akabo Arbenz threatened United Fruit and agribusiness interests in that country, as Mossadegh in Iran threatened Western oil interests. That provoked a sharp backlash from Brussels, from London, and from New York. The Dulles brothers happened to represent some of these mining interests, actually. And so Patrice Lumumba's days are numbered. He's overthrown by a CIA-supported coup. He's put under house arrest. And then it's a very dramatic story. He makes a dash for freedom with his wife and some of his closest aides and their infant son. And they know if they can get to a province about a day's journey away, that where his stronghold, then he'll have safety. And he hopes to raise an army then and to fight back and take his presidential office back. And so it's actually, I think, one of the most dramatic episodes, during this time. He is slowed down as he's making his journey by people in different villages. He's this charismatic figure. He loves his people. They want him to speak. He speaks. He finally gets to the river, which is going to be the final crossing to safety. And he crosses the river with a couple aides in a dugout canoe. And he gets to the other side, and Mobutu's troops catch up just at that moment with his wife and his infant son and the people he's left behind on the other bank. And his aides who've crossed the river with him beg Lumumba not to go back. They tell him almost tearfully that the fate of the nation is in his hands. But he says that life is tragic, and he gets back in the canoe, and he's, of course, captured. Now, the way the CIA tells the story after this is that he fell into the hands of some of his worst enemies in the province, I believe, of Katanga, and that he's basically executed by these enemies. And the CIA, though they wanted to kill him, they had tried to poison him earlier and so on, they said, we had nothing to do with his final execution. Well, actually, we now know from, I think, some very good recent research and new documents that that's not true. It's probably one of the first cases of extraordinary rendition. The CIA actually facilitated the transfer of Lumumba to his worst enemies. He's horribly beaten and tortured and murdered. And some of the people who were involved in that were actually on the CIA payroll. So that was a CIA execution.
So could you tell us more about the overthrow of the Guatemalan government and the attempted coup on Charles de Gaulle?
Well, let's start with de Gaulle, because I think that's one that most people... How many people know that there was an attempted coup to overthrow Charles de Gaulle in France in April 1961? Well, Berkeley, you're very informed. That's more than most audiences.
KPFA.
So there was indeed an attempted coup. Of course, the war in Algeria was dragging on, this terrible colonial war. It was causing sharp fractures within the ruling circles in France. De Gaulle, of course, is a military man and a conservative, but he realizes this bloodletting and this chaos has to end. So he's trying to negotiate a deal with the Algerian independence movement. But this provokes a sharp backlash from some of his own generals in Algeria. And there is indeed a coup attempt in late April of 1961, just as Kennedy is dealing with the crisis in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion. He's suddenly facing another crisis in France because reports in the Paris newspapers are starting to say that the CIA and the U.S. government are backing this right-wing coup against de Gaulle. And the French ambassador frantically meets with JFK, and JFK assures the French ambassador that he himself has nothing to do with it, but he can't speak for his own CIA. And he probably, was feeling that way, particularly because of what had happened at the Bay of Pigs. But this was a double whammy for this young president. So that's an alarming message for the American president to send to his counterpart in France. I am not in control of my own intelligence agency. Actually, Kennedy offers to come to de Gaulle's help with military support, but de Gaulle turns that down. I think the prospect of American soldiers shooting and killing French soldiers on French soil was too much for this proud nationalist to stomach. But he goes before his people in a very dramatic moment in his full-dress uniform, the old general, and says to French men, French women, aid me, help me. And they do. They pour into the streets. They block the runways so the paratroopers can't, military airplanes from Algeria can't land there. The left-wing workers in auto factories ask for arms so they can protect the factory there. Andre Malraux, the French cultural minister, is in the streets getting people to surround the cultural ministry. The Communist Party turns out people in force, the Catholic Church, and really most of French civil society comes together around their embattled president, and the military plotters back down, and democracy wins the day. Well, de Gaulle never, I think, got over that. He was always suspicious of Dulles. They have history that go back to World War II. But from then on, I think, de Gaulle begins to, because he's a shrewd power player, try to uproot sort of U.S. intelligence and people who were aligned with U.S. intelligence from his own administration, and to purge his government as much as possible, partly for his own safety. He was the target again and again of attempted assassinations. The Day of the Jackal, the famous film and book, were based on one of those assassination attempts that was eerily similar in some ways to Dallas in November '63, snipers ambushing the president in his limousine as he was riding with his wife. He survived that because he had a very good security team, and they protected him. But after he comes back from Washington after the funeral of President Kennedy, de Gaulle says a remarkable thing. He says that that Lee Harvey Oswald was a scapegoat. He says that Kennedy has been killed by the same U.S. national security forces that targeted him. But he says that they'll never let that truth come out, that the American system won't allow that. It would be too traumatic. It would cause such disruption in the American body politic that it just will never happen. He says something like Jack Nicholson's line in that film, they don't want to know the truth, they can't handle the truth. It's a very startling remark, and he said it to his information minister, who later wrote about it in his memoir years later. Very little part of that quote was quoted in American media reports. The full remarks of Charles de Gaulle on what happened in Dallas, I think, not until my book, have been fully translated.
So Guatemala.
Guatemala. Well, I think we're all familiar generally with what happened there. This young Kennedy-like couple comes to power, Acabo and Maria Arbenz, glamorous, wealthy couple, but very committed to uplifting the poor in that almost medieval country ruled by land barons, oligarchy, and United Fruit, the international agribusiness colossus that owns much of the Caribbean. And Arbenz made a fatal mistake, I guess, in terms of Washington's view. He expropriated land that was not being used by United Fruit and gave it to landless peasants. And that began, again, this series of events that led to his ouster, CIA-backed military coup. Pardon me? Yes, I think you're right. There was some compensation involved. Yes, you're right. But what I focus on that was remarkable to me is the tragic story of the Arbenz family after they were overthrown, because in some ways that, I think, symbolized the tragedy of the entire country. In his final radio address to his country, he says, look, I'm leaving. I have to step down for the good of the country. Che had told him, advised Arbenz and his people, arm the people, fight back, a young Che Guevara who was there at the time. But Arbenz refused to do it. I interviewed members of the Arbenz family, his grandson and granddaughter, and they said that he just felt that would lead to a bloodbath, because people weren't trained in arms and that they would just be massacred. But of course, sadly, that is what happened over decades of time. There was an ongoing bloodbath in Guatemala. It became one of the 20th century's worst killing fields. But Arbenz flees. At the airport there, they have to basically fuck with him every step of the way, they being the CIA. Howard Hunt is there at the airport as Arbenz and his family finally are allowed to flee into exile. But he's stripped at the airport in front of all the media and cameras and so on. He has to strip to his underwear because the military dictatorship that's taken over claims that he might be stealing currency, taking currency out of the country. Obviously, it's just a humiliation. And then the humiliation and the harassment continue. He's like the Flying Dutchman. The family can't land anywhere. The State Department, the CIA, put pressure on virtually every country, Mexico, other countries throughout Latin America, not to take them in. He briefly is taken in France, but he's under such scrutiny that he doesn't feel comfortable there. Finally, they go behind the Iron Curtain briefly to the Czechoslovakia, I think, and they don't feel that that is, a kind of environment they want to be in. He ends his days finally, Arbenz, in Mexico. His daughter kills herself at one point, a daughter he was very close to. He ends up dying in very mysterious circumstances, scalded to death in a bathtub in a Mexico City hotel. His family is convinced it was an assassination. But that is, part of the unfolding and terrible tragedy of Guatemala.
We've got a lot of questions that kind of hit on the same area over and over again, and most of them are dealing with the JFK assassination. In your book, you say that JFK's domestic and foreign policies caused a lot of tension in the imperial class. They're super rich. So do you really think that is the setup for the main emphasis for the assassination attempt?
Yeah, I think the Kennedy presidency broke in two. It fractured over primarily national security issues, but I think JFK was also antagonizing the corporate class in other ways. I think the U.S. steel crisis in 1962 has not really gotten the kind of attention historically that it should. But this was a major rupture, again, between Kennedy and sort of the corporate elite. U.S. Steel played a very central role in the economy at that point, in this, still largely industrial, pre-technological economy. And when they raised their prices, they would send inflationary ripples throughout the economy. So this was, from the point of view of the president and trying to manage inflation, that was a key factor that he had to address. And JFK did address it. He sat down with the union leaders. He got concessions from the Steel Workers Union and so on, and the major steel companies that they would, to contain prices. But U.S. Steel, Roger Blau, the CEO, stabbed him in the back. And after they had this deal, he came to the White House and announced, "I'm breaking the deal." Kennedy was furious, and this was the Kennedys at their true Irish best. He unleashed his brother, the ruthless Bobby Kennedy, who basically went stormtrooper on the steel industry. He sends FBI agents into the executive offices of U.S. Steel. They raid their files. They said basically they're looking for everything, not just corporate information about the collusion that was happening to raise prices, but also personal stuff on the steel executives. They really played hardball. And they bring the Defense Department in, and McNamara's defense secretary threatens not to buy their steel for the military and so on. And they caved. The U.S. steel industry and U.S. Steel in particular caved within a matter of days. But the venomous feelings from that continued to ripple for some time. The business press is furious. They say this is, authoritarianism. It's Kennedy's out of control. Kennedy was so aware of how acrimonious these feelings were and he would often deflect these with his, that Kennedy wit. He was at, I believe, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel for an event not long after that, and he heard that Eisenhower was at another banquet hall in the same hotel at the same time that evening, being given an award by U.S. Steel. And he says at one point, as he's making his remarks at his own event, the U.S. steel industry wanted to give me an award too, but they wanted to come down to the White House to give it to me, and the Secret Service wouldn't let them. So, using the prospect of assassination in a kind of comedic way. So, yeah, I think Kennedy, I don't think, again, we fully understood. Certainly the historian class has not fully understood how at war Kennedy was with some of the major centers of power in American society, with corporate power centers, with Wall Street, with the Pentagon, with the CIA, and so on. And so when I say that I believe Allen Dulles was kind of the point man for what happened to JFK ultimately in Dallas, again, he's not acting on his own. He's not some rogue agent. He's not some Superman that's able to do this single-handedly. Allen Dulles and his brother, whose brother was dead by then, would only move in this kind of decisive and way when they felt there was a consensus within their circle. And I believe, and this is, I think, in some ways the most provocative thing I write in the book, I believe there was a consensus at those high levels that Kennedy was an aberrant president and that he had to go for the good of the nation, that he was putting the country at risk, he was a weak president, he was undermining the economy, and that there was no way to legally remove him, and they were afraid he was going to be reelected in '64. Lyndon Johnson, who was kind of their man in the Kennedy administration, looked like he was going to be ousted because of corruption scandals. So they weren't even going to have the little leverage that LBJ brought them. You have to really immerse yourself in sort of the business press and in the statements that are being made by generals and corporate chiefs about Kennedy at the time to see how virulent these feelings were about him. And it's quite striking. I mean, some people, even years later, generals used the terms treasonous. They felt that Kennedy was treasonous.
Yeah, so you're not by yourself. I mean, many of these questions are asking the same thing about corporations. The whole thing here, this question kind of wraps it all up. It says, when you talk about this in your book about Allen Dulles' connection to the Council of Foreign Relations, I mean, there's that same powerful connection there too. I mean, the Rockefeller family and all those things that you bring up under that foreign relations umbrella there.
Again, this is a very cohesive group, and I'm sure that sort of the power elite or the deep state, or what term you would use to describe it, probably is a more complex group these days than it was back in the Cold War. But it tended to be a much more uniform group, I think, in those days. They went to the same schools. They were mostly white men. They were WASPs. They exchanged offices with each other. They often belonged to the same club. Some of the conversations, I'm sure, were spontaneous, but some were very formal. I mean, some of these decisions were arrived at in very formal ways. And you can see from the minutes of the Council on Foreign Relations meetings and interviewing some of the people who were part of those procedures how these decisions were made. Now, of course, no notes were taken about the decision to kill President Kennedy. There has to be a certain amount of speculation there. But you can see from the way that C. Wright Mills writes about the power elite and from my own kind of understanding of it, how these decisions would have come about. So
this question kind of ties into that. This is, do you think that the power elite is in control of the mainstream media, and will they just? You kind of touched on this earlier. Will they just ignore your book like they've ignored many others on the assassination?
Well, that's where they're at their most transparent, I think, in some ways, is how they manipulate the media and how the cover-up in the case of JFK happened. I mean, you can read, actually, in Allen Dulles' own papers at Princeton, the kind of very cozy letters and back and forth between Dulles and major editors or the CEOs of every leading media company. The Sulzberger family in the New York Times, Kay Graham and the Graham family at Washington Post, Newsweek, Henry Luce and Claire Booth Luce at Time Life Empire. They dined together, they slept with one another, they were on not just a first name, but a nickname basis with each other. He was Allie to the people at the New York Times. And so he had the kind of power where he could call up the New York Times and say, you know what, I don't like your coverage of Guatemala, which he did, with Sidney Gruson, the foreign correspondent there for the New York Times, and got him removed. I saw another letter from the top editor of the Washington Bureau of Newsweek right after the Warren Report was released. And basically he said, "Thank you, Alan, so much for helping direct our coverage of the Warren Report. We couldn't have done it without you." I mean, Alan Dulles was on the Warren Commission. That's not the kind of thing you want from journalists who are being objective. So, yeah, they were intertwined. The media, I still think, is complicit with power. It's part of the problem. That's why I started Salon years ago, to create more alternative voices. We're involved in a culture war every day over what the truth is and what power wants to let us know. So yeah, my book is being blocked in different places. I was lined up at Politico to have a piece run about my book, an excerpt from my book. A national security reporter who I know, who's actually, I think, has a lot of integrity, who works there, called my book, he read the book, called it a masterpiece, and he was very keen on having it showcased there. He got his boss, basically, to commission me to do a piece, and before I could even write it, I was told, no, we're not going to do that now, and they ran instead this piece by Phil Shannon from the New York Times that basically alleged that Fidel Castro killed Kennedy. So that was what happened at Politico. I was in a car literally being driven to the studio at Al Jazeera America in Manhattan, and I was booked to be on a show there, and my publicist got a call, "It's off, it's been canceled." And he'd never had something like this happen to him before, and so he emailed the producer there and said, "What's going on?" And he got a one-word reply from this Al Jazeera producer. The reply said, "Politics." So that even Al Jazeera America. The Washington Post let this same publicist, my publicist, know that they weren't going to touch my book. They wouldn't review it. So yeah, this is a blackout. But on the other hand, there are cracks in the system, like Leonard Cohen says. That's how the light get in. We have enough, thank God, alternative media. We have social media that the word about the book is getting out and spreading. Amy Goodman, I think, when she had me on Democracy Now!
What station was that on? She was.
I think it's called KPFA. And KPFA, God bless Quincy, McCoy, and all of KPFA. Yeah. But, it's amazing how we have a lot of power. There are ripples that, one show like that, like Democracy Now! Will create other ripples. And suddenly I'm getting calls from lots of radio stations. Local radio, to me, once again, I'm seeing it as this bastion of democracy still and the First Amendment. They still can't control everything. So I just heard today, right before I came over here, that the book has just become a bestseller in California.
Yeah, baby.
Yeah. And that's the Northern California and the Southern California independent booksellers bestseller list.
That's awesome.
That's another bastion of democracy, independent booksellers.
It's awesome, Dave. Congratulations. So we're going to do some more of these questions, or we're not going to get out of here. What do you think prompted Vincent? Is it Bugliosi to write his huge pro-Warren Commission book?
I can't possibly analyze Vincent Bugliosi. He was such a mess of contradictions. I mean, he believed that Bobby Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy. He told me that. He's dead now, but he wrote this doorstopper of a book, even bigger than my book. Reclaiming History, that attempted to be the final word on the JFK assassination, and that Lee Harvey Oswald had done it, case closed. Not to be too conspiratorial, but my book Brothers was due to come out around the same time, and my publisher told me, this other book its pub date has just been shifted to go up against your book. So I do think that's the games that the government, the CIA, whoever still play. It's a culture war, and I think things get counter-programmed. The CIA has a major, of course, operation in Hollywood. I have a new book in print called Hot Books, and a very good investigative journalist has just turned in a manuscript for me called Spooking the News, which is going to be all about how the CIA continues to manipulate the media at Hollywood as well.
Talk some more about Hot Books, some of the other stuff that you have, so that everybody knows about that.
Yeah,
too.
so Hot Books, I was frustrated by the fact that there really is a shrinking space in the news world for deep investigative work. And so I, with Skyhorse, which is a very scrappy and brave independent publisher in New York, created this new imprint called Hot Books. And we're focusing on doing short books, 40,000 words, on the most provocative issues. Our first book was not an investigative book so much, it was a collection of essays, and KPFA featured that author, a young African-American author out of Baltimore, D. Watkins. You might have heard him on Fresh Air or KPFA. And his book was called The Beast Side, which is what the east side of Baltimore is called, Living and Dying While Black in America. And, Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, which is wonderful, seemed to suck all the air out of the room in a way, but D. Watkins' book is starting to break through, and it's a very important book by a very important new voice. One of our next books will be American Nuremberg by a USF philosophy professor named Rebecca Gordon, who wrote a book. Yes, Rebecca Gordon wrote a book called Mainstreaming Torture, about how we as a culture have come to accept torture as part of the American way of life. And this new book is called American Nuremberg. And it's going to be an indictment of the leading U.S. officials who should stand trial for war crimes post 9/11. And one more book I want to give a shout out to. Joseph Hickman is a very important military whistleblower. He was stationed at Guantanamo, and he wrote a very important book called Murder at Camp Delta. His work was excerpted by Harper's and a cover story there, and they won the National Magazine Award for it. Joe Hickman is a brave whistleblower, and after that book came out, where he talked about the murders of several detainees at Guantanamo under interrogation, he began getting calls from other GIs, other soldiers who had their own stories. And one soldier, while he was talking to Joe Hickman on the phone, suddenly had a violent coughing fit. And he said, "Sorry, man," when he got back on the phone, "it's the burn pits. I brought back the burn pits with me." And he goes, "What are those?" And so Joe began to find out and do some research on the fact that virtually every military base in Afghanistan and Iraq had these open-air burn pits where everything literally was tossed in violation of environmental standards and even the Pentagon's own standards. Medical waste, plastics, tires. Some of the burn pits were built on ground that was contaminated with old WMDs, mustard gas, and so on. And so now it's going to be the Agent Orange scandal of the wars in the Middle East. Thousands of soldiers now have been coming home over the last few years with terrible respiratory diseases and rare cancers, including, we're going to make a case for Beau Biden, who was stationed at one of the worst bases where this burn pit pollution was a daily 24/7 phenomenon.
Wow. So here's a question. What do you know about Dorothy Kilgard and her so-called suicide on November?
Kilgallen.
What is it?
Dorothy Kilgallen.
Oh, I can't read this. It's Kilgallen. Okay. So-called suicide on November 8th, 1965. Supposedly she was about to break some news about the JFK assassination. So you know anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many fascinating, things that happened while the case was still warm. When people were talking, the old line is, well, someone would have talked, if there was a conspiracy. But of course, a number of people were talking, and some ended up dead. Others just weren't listened to. The media didn't want to hear their story. Dorothy Kilgallen's one of those interesting stories. I don't know definitively what happened, but she was this well-known gossip columnist. She was one of the regular guests on What's My Line? Some of you my age might remember her.
Oh, her.
Dorothy Kilgallen, yes. She was an American icon in some ways. And she became obsessed with the Kennedy assassination and got a line into Jack Ruby while he was in jail. And went down there and did a lengthy interview with him at some point with Jack Ruby in his jail cell, and came home telling friends that she was going to break open the Kennedy case, and that she was started to work on a book, and part of the manuscript was finished. She was found dead in her bed of an overdose. I forget the year, maybe it was 65. And there were some people who were close to her that, based on, I don't know the exact details of her death, were very suspicious that it was a murder. So that's all I know about that.
Okay. This question is: clearly the CIA does a great deal of harm in the world and to our own country. Does it do any good? Could we do without it?
Well, I think we have, let's just focus on the drone assassination program. I certainly think there's, the CIA has been given far too long a leash, that the drone assassinations in particular is something that I feel a great concern about. I do think they amount, many of those assassinations, to war crimes. Imagine this. I mean, back in the 70s, there was great public outcry when the Church Committee revealed that several foreign leaders had been targeted for assassination by Kennedy. Now, speaking of Rebecca Gordon and mainstreaming torture, the idea that we routinely choose, the President of the United States and his top security people, routinely choose who to kill every day, or virtually every day, in some remote part of the world, to me is morally appalling. And I think on some level, because he keeps wrestling with this in these various ways, I think Obama understands this on some level. And he announced that he's going to curtail the program, but then it keeps going on. I mean, I think every president has been a captive of the national security beast, as I've been describing tonight, since JFK, challenged them directly. So, I think we're compromised morally as a nation by the drone assassination program, but look, what's happening with our presidential campaign? None of this is being discussed. I mean, even Bernie Sanders, who's done a wonderful job focusing on the wealth gap as his primary issue, really hasn't been wrestling with this in a major way that I can see at this point. Hillary Clinton, of course, is part of the problem. I mean, she was part of that national security state. And she may be saying some progressive things at this point to win the nomination, but I certainly don't trust her to reform it. And the Republican Party only wants more of the same. So if our democratic rituals, we can't even debate something as profoundly wrong about the country as this, then I fear we're really lost. And so the only way this is going to rise up to the level where it becomes a national concern is if people like us, in town hall meetings like this, through social media, through whatever kind of voice we have. And I want to use my book tour, obviously, to not just talk about the history, but talk about the through line. Because torture, extraordinary rendition, CIA black sites, mind control experimentation, extra-legal assassinations, subversion of foreign governments, even friendly governments, that didn't begin after 9/11. It began during the Dulles era. So I want to use this book to make those connections and to help spark the debate that is long overdue.
Just a couple of more questions before you go sign some books. But since you brought it up, I got to tell you that almost half of these are based on one thing. What are your thoughts on 9/11? I mean,
I'm going to have to turn
so
that one over to Peter.
there's so many of them. I just
You know, I've been following in some ways Peter Dale Scott's path in Brothers and now in this book, and I thought my days about writing about this great epic battle between the national security state and democracy were over. But I have to say, inspired by Peter's work and some other people who've done great work there, that may be my next book. But I really don't know enough to really comment on it right now in an informed way. I certainly have suspicions, like we all do, about what occurred. We certainly know that our democracy was all but robbed from us after 9/11, and that I'll leave it at there.
So the last question then will be, are you concerned, we've talked about this before, for your personal safety in view of many of the murdered researchers and witnesses out there in the world?
You know, I think enough time has elapsed where, that kind of risk is not what it once was. I mean, yeah, I think there were people who were paid with their lives for digging too much into this or threatening to tell what they knew. I've never been directly threatened. I was sort of indirectly threatened at one point, talking to a guy who was involved in the anti-Cuba operation. This is during my book on Brothers. I guess I feel that when my time's up, it's up. I think it's, any risk that I do take, and I don't think it is a huge risk, is well worth it. The way I think they fight you now is through, as I was saying earlier, by counter-programming you. It's by silencing you. It's by, flooding the media suddenly with some bogus, new material that is meant to confuse people and distract from, the good work that's being done, like my book. So, yeah, I mean, right now, it's not fear at all I feel. I feel rage. I feel anger, and I want to fight. Ishmael Reed, the great Oakland writer, once wrote a book called Writin' is Fightin', and that's exactly what I feel. That's the arena we're in now. It's the war of ideas, and we've got to win.
Ladies and gentlemen, David Talbot, thank you.